Gated reverb is a classic music production technique where you have a sound with a really long reverb and a cut off tail instead of letting the reverb trail out. It's commonly used to say take a snare sound like this and turn it into something cool like this. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can create this gated reverb effect inside of Ableton Live, and in this video, I'm gonna go through some of the most effective ones. If you're new here, my name's Matt. I make tools and tutorials to help you master your music, find your sound, and create with confidence. Let's dive into the video. So as we showed before, here's a quick example of a gated reverb. So I've got this dry snare sound here, which I just have some saturation and some EQ on. And here I've got this gated reverb audio effect rack, and if I turn this on, we get that kind of gated reverb effect. And this particular one is done using kind of the second most complicated method, and we'll go through how to set this up in a little bit, but let's start with the kind of least complicated version of a gated reverb. So the most simple version of a gated reverb is basically exactly what it sounds like, a reverb that has been followed by a gate to be gated. So let's go ahead and add a reverb to our track. Then let's simply go ahead and put Ableton Live's gate after the reverb. Now, if you're using Ableton Live Lite, you won't have access to this gate device, but there are third-party options. Simply a quick search for gate VST or something along those lines should show you something. So now all we need to do is just increase the decay of this reverb and adjust the threshold and settings of the gate here. So pull down the threshold until we basically get the length of the reverb that we want. Then we can further adjust the kind of envelope of this reverb by playing around with the hold and release times on the gate. If we increase the hold, for example, we get it to hold out longer, but still with a sharp cutoff. And if we increase the release, we're now going to get the reverb to tail off over time a little bit. Now, it's important to note that this is actually my default gate preset here, and in yours, you might have the floor set to -40 dB, this floor control. I recommend pulling this all the way down to -infinity. That way the reverb will actually cut off its tail rather than having a little bit of a lingering sound. So this is a really important control to pull all the way down to -infinity. Now, of course, in this method, we don't get a huge amount of control over, say, the level of the reverb compared to the level of the dry signal. So instead, probably what's a better thing to do is to select both the reverb and the gate, right-click, and group these, then go to the chain list, right click and create a new chain. Let's call this chain dry, and let's call this first chain wet, and then go to the reverb in the wet chain and set it to 100% wet. And now we have this wet chain that is the reverb, and this dry chain, which is the snare. But you'll notice that with this particular setup, we're gonna have to adjust the settings of the gate because it's no longer being triggered by the dry level of the snare. So we're probably gonna have to pull down the threshold a little bit, and then adjust our timing settings. So maybe increase that again, maybe pull down the hold, pull down the release a little bit. So this is your most basic gated reverb setup where we have a reverb followed by a gate, which is running in parallel to the dry signal. However, we can do an extra thing in this setup to give us a little bit more control over the timing and tail of the reverb. So currently this gate here is being triggered by the reverb and also applying its effect to the reverb. For those of you who don't really understand what a gate is, basically, as soon as the signal goes above this particular threshold, the gate will open, and then when the signal falls below the threshold, or in this case 3 dB below the threshold because of this return control, the gate will close, turning down the sound over the course of the amount of time we have set by this hold and release control to a level determined by this floor control. Now, this works all really well, but if we say increase the decay time of this reverb, because now we're elongating this reverb, and because it's a reverb, it doesn't have a very kind of fast attack or onset, our struggle now is going to be adjusting the gate controls so that we can let less or more of the reverb through. And then you might get to a point where you get a little bit of kind of jitteriness with the sound, particularly if you have a bit of a higher threshold and faster hold time. And you also get some inconsistencies because of how the reverb is building up. So this is where we're going to use the sidechain functionality of the gate to have the gate be triggered by a different sound. And in this case, that sound is going to be the dry snare. So I'm going to rename this audio effect rack to gated reverb. And then I'm going to come to the gate in this chain, open up the sidechain options, turn on the external mode, and from the source, I'm going to select the track that this gate is on, come down to this second drop-down menu, and we're going to select gated reverb, which is this bottom rack down here, and select the dry chain pre-effects. And so now this gate on this reverb, instead of being triggered by the reverb, is being triggered by the dry snare, but applying the gate to the reverb. What this means is that when the dry snare exceeds the threshold, then the reverb gets let through, and then the reverb, of course, is controlled by the envelope controls of the gate. So we can increase the hold, increase the release. And then we could have a really massive reverb, say set the decay to even longer and adjust some of these parameters here, potentially, but we still get the exact same length of time of the gate because it's being triggered by the dry snare. And this gives us a lot more control and consistency over the length of the reverb, whilst allowing us to shape the tone and timbre of the reverb without having to adjust the settings of the gate. For example, we could go ahead now and start applying some effects on this wet chain. I could add, say, an EQ to focus in on certain frequencies, remove some low frequencies, maybe dial some areas down and really shape the timbre or tone of the reverb. And we could even add, say, like a comb filter using Ableton Live's auto filter device, set this to comb, pull down the frequency, and then maybe pull down the dry wet a little bit to get something a little bit more interesting in terms of its timbre. And now all we need to do is adjust the hold time or the release time of the gate, and we can adjust the timing of our newly shaped reverb. Now, this technique works super well for the vast majority of instances, but there is one glaring issue with it, and that's that the reverb continues to run in the background before the gate, even though the gate's cutting it off and we're not able to hear it. This is really important to know because it means that if we have a very long reverb time, say pulled all the way up to like 60 seconds with a really large size, and we've got a bunch of audio effects that maybe apply some processing and elongation to the reverb, the sound of the reverb every time it passes through the gate is going to be different because it's going to be continuing to build up in the background even though we're not able to hear it. You can hear that it's kind of getting louder because the sound is building up over time, even though it's being cut off by the gate. So now this is where we can use some other interesting modulation techniques to actually gate the reverb by turning the whole chain on or off so that the reverb triggers in exactly the same way and sounds exactly the same every single time the gate is opened or triggered. So let's start just by collapsing up the reverb, the EQ, and this auto filter, and I'm actually going to turn off the gate. Next, I'm going to add an envelope follower before this gated reverb. And then after this envelope follower, I'm going to add a shaper device. I'm going to set both the envelope follower and the shaper to remote mode. And then this shaper, I'm going to set to one-shot mode. Next, I'm going to go ahead and map the envelope follower to this little T button on the shaper, which is the trigger button. Just for demonstration, I'm going to turn off the gated reverb. And now let's take a look at what's happening here. The sound is coming through, triggering this envelope follower. And then when the envelope follower is hitting a certain threshold, it's going to trigger this shaper to activate its shape and modulate whatever it's attached to. Currently, this is not reaching loud enough, so I'm going to increase the gain of this envelope follower. And now we can see whenever this envelope follower is triggered or receives a sound, it's going to trigger this shaper to activate, which we can see in this little display right here. So now all we need to do is map this shaper to control the on-off of the gated reverb. I'm going to add another point into this shaper just by clicking, and then make it so this shaper has its shape entirely on, off, and it's important that it turns off at the end, even though it's all the way up here as well. So we have these 2 points at the start and these 2 points at the end. Now take a look at what happens. We have this envelope follower triggering the shaper to turn on and engage the gated reverb to turn on and then off over the course of whatever the rate this shaper is set to, which is currently 1/4 note. I could make it say 1/8 note, and now we're only going to get this reverb for an 1/8 note. Or I could make it longer, maybe say half a bar, and now we're going to get 2 beats worth of reverb. And you'll notice that every single time this is triggered, it sounds virtually identical because the reverb is not processing sound in the background, it's actually being turned on or off every single time the snare sound hits. And so now we have complete freedom to put in a bunch of extra effects and stuff in here if we want to, or you can even take this one step further and add another shaper. Again, have this envelope follower mapped to it, turn it to remote mode, map this to the trigger of this shaper, and then so you can have it so this shaper controls the level of the wet chain on the gated reverb. So we could map this shaper to this wet chain, and then we could have it say fade in over time, remote, and set this to maybe 0 to kind of 90%. And now take a listen as this reverb fades in over time as well as being gated. You can even do some interesting shapes, for example, like an interesting jagged shape. And you can start to get some very interesting effects using this method. But the biggest benefit of this shaper method is that you get to time the length of the gated reverb to your track, say quarter note, eighth notes, etc., because of how the shaper functions. And of course, you don't just have to apply this to snare sounds, you could apply it to absolutely anything and get some really cool and interesting results. Things like drum loops, percussion loops, and even vocals or synth loops can work pretty well with this effect too. If you want to learn to master Ableton racks and to build your own custom ones, then check out my Ableton Rack Mastery course, which is the ultimate guide to Ableton racks. Thank you so much for watching. Click the like button if you liked, subscribe if you're new. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, stay awesome, and I'll see you all in the next video.